Welcome to What If, So What, the podcast where we ask what's possible with digital and figure out how to make it real in your business. I'm Jim Hertzfeld.
And I'm Kim Chopek. We're part of Perficient's digital strategy team, and today we'll ask what if, so what, and most importantly, now what? When I was growing up, my grandmother would make a day of taking me shopping at Wieboldt's, a regional department store in the Chicagoland area. It was one of my favorite things to do. In my young eyes, everyone looked fancy and important. The mannequins were merchandised to show the latest fashions. It smelled good, and best of all, everyone knew my grandmother by name. It felt like no matter how big or small her ask, the salespeople would make it happen. The last Wieboldt's closed in 1987, and by that time, it wasn't the same. Struggling to keep up with the excitement of mall culture and the price competition of emerging big box stores, the local department stores didn't have the flexibility to reinvent themselves, so they, along with all local and regional stores around the country, ended up closing. Funny thing is, the approach these stores were known for is now what we would call high touch, one-on-one personalized and hyper-local, exactly what retailers today strive for. In this episode, we talk all things modern retail with John Gregory, industry veteran currently serving as Spotify's global head of industry for retail. He shares his perspective on what is needed to get traditional retailers unstuck from self-inflicted wounds rooted way back in the 1970s, and how the key to staying ahead is a lot more than digital adoption. Welcome, John, to the podcast. We're really excited for you to be here to talk all things retail. Let's start by just getting an idea of who you are, what you do, your day-to-day.
Who I am? Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity. I always like to have the chance to talk about retail. Having been in the industry for a long time, I feel like I have a pretty good background. I have spent the majority of my career actually on the client side of retail. Started my career back in the last century, back in the early 80s, working in the department store industry, and spent time at Bloomingdale's for about 10 years and Ann Taylor in the specialty fashion area for a while. And actually had the luxury of flipping to the agency side of the business for a couple of years at MediaVest, managing the Walmart account, which was quite an experience, quite an education to say the least. Then flipped back into the digital publishing side of the industry at AOL and 5 years at Pandora and now at Spotify. So I'm lucky enough to have a pretty well-rounded experience, not only of the retail industry, but having seen, all corners of the business from being the client to being the agency rep, serving the client, to being on the digital side, selling media to agencies and clients. So it's been quite a ride so far. All specializing in the retail industry, of course.
Yes, and I found that intriguing. You were very adamant. You call yourself a retail specialist. Why not retail expert? You've earned it.
Well, it's funny. I hear people using that term all the time, and I think it's a bit ridiculous, really, especially in this day and age when things change so quickly, and you're only as good as what you knew the day before. So I think calling yourself an expert is a little bit presumptuous, to say the least. I think the best we can be is specialists and have as much of an understanding of the business as we can, and that's really my role at Spotify. I work with all areas of the organization. Whether it be product development or the selling organization or the communications team and marketing. And I do my best to represent the retail industry and all the subcategories that are within that industry based on what I know and the information I have as of this moment.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. To your point, retail changes so quickly. But you said you started your career in retail in the 1980s. And I got to say, I feel like as quickly as retail changes, it still seems to be stuck in 1985. Why is that?
Well, so much has changed in the industry, fundamental changes really that I think aren't often recognized. Pre-1970s, retail in the United States was much more regionally based. A lot of it was privately held, and it was much more localized in the sense of serving their local constituents and their local customers, and they knew their customers because it was so local. And one of the structural things that changed in the economy that I think that really blew the retail industry apart was the oil embargo and the recessions that followed in the 70s. And that had a tremendous impact on the retail industry due to the unemployment and inflation and the after effects of that recession. And it really resulted in a lot of consolidation of the industry to survive during those rough years of stagflation. And for that reason, it just became a little more, say not boring, but mundane. The merchandising changed dramatically. And then you had the entry of Walmart at about the same time, which was great for the economy because, there were a lot of people who needed low price options during those years of the 70s and early 80s when the economy was like just in the dumpster. But it came at a bad time for like the historic or the traditional retailers that they all were not only fighting for survival, but now fighting for low price to compete with Walmart. And that kind of, brought everything down to the lowest common denominator as, how can we do things as cheaply as possible with the volumes necessary to be profitable? And it really changed the dynamics of creative merchandising, I believe, in the industry. And there was a point in time when the mantra was just increasing total sales to satisfy, Wall Street. And that meant building new stores at the expense of what it meant to serve local clienteles. And I think it had a huge impact on the industry. And then, of course, Amazon starts to rear its ugly head in the 90s, which added just yet another element of disruption to the industry. So I think there were a lot of things hitting the legacy retailers over those years of the 70s and 80s and up into like the 2000s, and it's been an adjustment ever since.
No doubt. It's just some level of risk aversion or like post-traumatic stress that just never really went away, I think. I totally agree with you. And you bring up Amazon kind of along the same lines. Direct to consumer was supposed to be this major disruptor. And I think it did move some consumer behaviors pretty fundamentally. And some retailers seem to be adjusting to that, but some don't. But what's your take on direct to consumer? Was it really that disruptive? And what do you think the future really holds now that we're seeing sort of a second wave of DTC?
Yeah, I think it really emerged at a point when the legacy retailers were becoming less creative because of that need to be low cost and competitive with the Walmarts of the world. And the DTCs that emerged over the last 10 to 15 years really were almost filling a void that was left by the traditional retailers because they offered some distinction in the marketplace. They focused on specific categories, specific products even sometimes, and they tried to do it better than anyone else is doing and serving the clientele that was most attracted to those products much more directly. E-com, obviously, there was an economy of scale and a universal ability to communicate those value propositions versus legacy retailers. So I think they really emerged at the right time as a reaction to the marketplace to fill a need for something new and different and something much more exciting to the consumer marketplace.
And I think, we're seeing a lot of shifts in our client base, more traditional, usually B2B organizations starting to think, well, maybe we should go direct. Do you think that's a good idea? What are some challenges you think that these traditional B2B organizations might be facing?
Well, I think it's been a wake-up call, I think, to the retail industry regarding the need to be much more creative, much more innovative in creative merchandising, which to me is the basis of retail. You can have as much innovation as you want in the marketplace. You can be as tech savvy as possible and omni-channel to the hilt. But unless you have the products that are interesting to the consumer you're trying to target, it's all for nothing. So I think the DTC players have really given the traditional retailers a wake-up call to start paying attention more to what they're doing and to broaden their appeal in merchandising or serving the clients through a direct-to-consumer online type of strategies. And I think it's possible, it's been proven you can do both. A traditional retailer can have the store, they can have, the mobile app for shopping, they can have specific programs or exclusives that are only available in that exclusive type of environment of a direct consumer type of distribution. So I think it's a matter of being flexible and being innovative and trying to look ahead as opposed to look behind. And that is, I think, one of the legacies of retail that has done such great damage. That, growing up in the 80s and 90s in retail, you always based your future year on what happened last year. if cashmere sweaters were selling big last year, well, we bought twice as many for the next year, as opposed to thinking, okay, that's had its moment. What's the next thing coming in the marketplace? And I think D2C has been, kind of that light under the rear end of some, or fire under the rear end of some retailers to get with it. Think creatively.
Oh, I can't agree more. As a bane of my existence on the brand side is what what was defined as innovation. And over COVID, because we are theoretically sort of post-pandemic as of the recording date here, so some retailers, to your point, really seem to thrive and maybe answer, the challenge of the DTC players, but others not so much. What's your take on who was prepared and why?
Well, I think it's so funny that when you look back before COVID, the talk of the industry was about being quote unquote omni-channel, to make sure that we had the capability to provide shopping experience or conversion across every channel, possible or to the consumer. And a lot did invest in those areas. And I think those are the ones that were successful. But a lot of retailers just ignored it. And, in my experience, retailers are loath to invest in or make capital expenditures that are not consumer facing, So the idea of investing in the IT and the talent that's required to build those capabilities, it wasn't as easily sold in to retail organizations as new store fixtures or, things that the consumer can see. So I think the ones that actually did pay attention and plan and understood the need to build the infrastructure are the ones that were successful post-COVID. Amazon obviously was prepared for this type of an event. There are some other retailers that did very well, Target, Walmart, some of the big box retailers who understood the investment necessary to be quote unquote omni-channel, which to me in itself is kind of a misnomer. Omni-channel to me is speaks to the infrastructure of the industry and serving customers, as opposed to a more marketing approach that involves the need for being omnichannel, but creates a much more consumer-facing approach to what that means to the customer. Having that harmonized experience across all touch points of the customer, whether they're shopping online or buying in store or whatever it may be. It's more than just having the mechanics. You have to be able to present that in a way that's relevant to the consumer.
Yeah, completely. And we talk a lot, to your point, about the omni-channel experience, but you can't have that experience if you don't have that infrastructure. So we've definitely seen that. And to your point, there have been so many articles and interviews and so on and so forth about customer behavior in retail post-pandemic. Do you think that's true? Have customer behaviors really changed that much? And if you think that they have, is anything going to stick, or are we just going to revert back to pre-pandemic behaviors?
I think the behaviors changed dramatically over the last 12 months. Most certainly during the first 6 months of the pandemic, but it was a forced behavior. If you wanted to feed your family or have household goods or supplies, you were forced to buy those online. So it created this as I said, forced adoption of getting familiar with mobile apps and e-commerce, whether you be 15 years old or 80 years old. That was the most interesting thing, is the adoption of older populations, to get used to using these types of services. And like as I said, the retailers that were prepared with these types of engagements did very well. I think that a lot of the behaviors will stick. Most certainly the need for providing all the services and options that have been up-leveled over the last 12 months. There's an expectation now in the marketplace. If I want it now, I can get it now. If I want it delivered at no cost, by gosh, I can have that too. And if I want it returned, it's like there's so much pressure on the retailer now to provide all these service options at no cost to the consumer. Thanks to Amazon and so forth, who have the wherewithal to lead with those types of services. But it's created this change in the marketplace that's led to this expectation of that type of service for all retailers. So, it will moderate. E-com bumped last year, but it's projected to settle back down over the upcoming years to a level of around like 15% of total retail sales is expected to be e-com. Last year, I think it was around 20%. So it's leveling back down, although it's still much higher, considerably higher than where it started before COVID. So I believe the e-commerce phenomenon will stick with us, but the pace of growth will moderate and kind of like continue where it left off pre-COVID. And there are some areas where, think about grocery shopping. where there's much more engagement with the product itself, fashion as well. The fashion suffered last year. I think that's going to come back in a strong way this year. And that type of shopping, it leads itself to more in-store type of engagement with the product itself. And same with grocery, fresh goods, meats, produce. I think customers are more apt to want to see that in person as opposed to buying it through a grocery commerce site. However, the commodity items and the staples, canned goods and so forth, I think that's definitely an opportunity that will continue for grocery and the like. But when it comes to fresh goods and fresh produce and just that idea that shopping is entertainment to a certain degree, it's a social type of activity,
Yes.
and you do it with your family and friends, and it's more than just a transaction. And that's what retailers need to get back to, that idea of excitement in the store and what makes that experience more than just a transaction. The things that Amazon can't do.
Yes, and you see Amazon trying to open these small physical locations. I think I saw an ad for Amazon Salon, and I honestly thought it might have been a late April Fool's joke. But I'm glad that you brought that up, though, because I think a lot of just general consumers, and if you're outside the retail industry, you hear so much about e-commerce and digital and so on and so forth. But what keeps getting missed is the bulk of revenue is still driven by physical locations. I mean, even pre-pandemic, when we were seeing foot traffic decline to physical locations, still it made up the bulk of revenue. You mentioned this, but I'm curious to dive a little deeper. What can retailers do to go beyond Amazon and make it more than a transaction? There were some inroads, I would say, in what I like to call phygital experiences in stores or physical locations pre-pandemic, but it was, I don't know, kind of kitschy, like the virtual fitting rooms and so on. Nothing that was truly sticky. What do you think needs to change in the physical locations?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. There were so many gimmicky types of things that retailers tried pre-COVID, but at least it was, moving in the right direction of testing and learning and trying to move the needle in ways that would make the store experience more exciting and more engaging. First of all, I think it comes back down to creative merchandising, making sure that your company has a point of view. You're not just selling things. You have something you're standing behind, whether it be service or product or the events in the store, whatever it may be. Have some point of view and make that your call to action for your target audience. So I think that's kind of the foundation of making the change in the marketplace. And this was happening pre-COVID. It's a shame, actually, that COVID happened when it did, because there were a lot of retailers who were making the move in that direction with capsule collections and exclusives and new product launches, things that really made retail exciting. It was more than just selling a commodity. It goes back to the idea of having talented buyers in place as well. We've reached a point, I think, in the 90s and the turn of the century when buyers seem to be like commodity traders. They could have just as easily been selling wheat or corn and bringing it into the store. I think we're getting back to that idea of the foundation of what retail really means, bringing products to the marketplace that are interesting to your target audience. And you can't be everything to everyone. And I think retailers were finally learning that and finally trying to build a brand proposition or a value proposition that was much more differentiated. And I think we'll return to that. But I think as a result of COVID, we'll have much more efficient operations in store, the micro warehousing, the availability of product, being able to order something in store that might not be available there, to have it delivered to your home. I mean, there's so many different innovations from a tech standpoint that will even make that in-store experience more impactful and more interesting.
I hope so. I always enjoyed going into the stores and kind of going in market and looking around and seeing the opportunities. And I do hope it becomes more of an experience.
Yeah, some of the things that Spotify is working on. I had a conversation with someone recently about the in-store music and how it used to be such an interesting thing for retailers to program, only to find out in recent research that everyone's wearing their earbuds in store. No one wants to even hear that store music anymore. So, we're working with a lot of retail clients to build interactions or engagements in the store based on QR codes on signage or products that helps them bring their own playlist to life in the store, in different areas of the store that relate to different products or different age groups that might be shopping different areas of the store. So even small things like that can have a big impact.
Oh, very cool. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So we both shared our frustration on this, but $1 million or more potentially question, when we think about comping post-pandemic, maybe you have a broader philosophy on comping, which I'm interested in hearing. But post-pandemic, regardless if a retailer saw growth or loss, how do you think they should think about comping for the coming year?
Well, last year was definitely, God willing, an anomaly in the marketplace. And I really believe that using last year as the foundation for your future forecast predictions or forecast models of business would be the wrong thing to do. I truly believe that 2019 is still essentially the baseline of the business. And if we saw anything last year that helped retail, it was really all about the technology that allowed retailers to survive in ways that they maybe hadn't considered in the past. So I think it's better to look at comping next year based on what shopping capabilities you can bring to the customer base as it relates to the product you're bringing in the store to build more awareness and get back to some sense of normalcy from a merchandising standpoint, but propelling the business forward based on the technology that you can put in place to make those shopping experiences more meaningful, more relevant to the contemporary shopper. And we're not over COVID yet. Everyone's acting as though it's we're back to normal and things will return as they were. We're not out of the woods yet. At least, definitely on a global perspective. Maybe in the U.S. things are looking fairly good, but if you read reports of how the rest of the world is reacting to COVID, with whether it's about the vaccines or access to vaccines or the new variants that are in the marketplace, I mean, there's still a lot of issues that need to be resolved that will help retail on a global perspective get back to normal. So we're not out of the woods yet.
That's such a great point. Even access to those raw materials, I know it continues to be a struggle. So, yeah.
Think about all of the resourcing from, the Far East or foreign lands, that even the blockage of the Suez Canal, think of the pandemonium that created from a supply chain perspective. I mean, little things can have big impacts in the global chain.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. We've talked with other guests, and that's kind of my running joke. The fact that my friends and family now know what a supply chain is means that there's a big impact in the market there.
Which actually is another interesting point. I mean, over the last year, we've seen how important it is for local retailers and local businesses to gain support and gain loyalty because they were there when some of the big players couldn't serve local communities. So I think there was a major resurgence of small business and the willingness for local consumers to support local businesses for that sense of loyalty and community. So I think that is one thing that's going to stick behind. We're going to see a huge resurgence in entrepreneurs and new businesses opening up and filling the gap where some of the big players maybe missed last year.
Yes, I personally experienced that here in our neighborhood in downtown Chicago, and it was really nice to see. Not only can you support, your local businesses, but you actually start meeting your neighbors again, and recognizing them, even with the masks on. So, kind of to wrap up here, we've talked about so much and you've been pretty clear on how you think retailers can stay ahead of the game here. But with some of these new local, entrepreneurs or some of the younger CEOs we've seen in the headlines that, maybe had taken some false starts, but really seem to be driving brands forward now. How can retailers really stay ahead without forgetting the lessons learned? How to be willing to take those risks and be willing to invest more in what consumers don't see. That's easy to say, but is there a higher level philosophy or advice you would share with retail leaders?
First and foremost, it's so important these days to have the operational flexibility to respond as quickly as possible to the marketplace. And we saw that last year with some retailers not knowing what to do next, when all this started to unfold and unravel. You had retailers like Dick's Sporting Goods or Tractor Supply Company who almost immediately redeployed their teams in ways that helped serve customers either with delivering product on the curb or delivering products with their store employees to homes. I mean, they were thinking fast and keeping pace with what was changing in the marketplace in a way that was possible. And I just think that's the key to success is not being afraid to change quickly and having the organization in place that would allow that to happen. The management structure that allows that to happen without God knows all the politics that could get in the way of making quick decisions like that. I've lived through it with some of the companies I've worked with. So I think that's an important key, to have a strong leader who is able to rally the troops and react quickly to the marketplace. Whether you're a mom and pop around the corner or whether you're a national chain, you have to react as quickly as possible. And a part of that is infrastructure and technology that allows you to do that. But also a lot of it is just the leadership and communication with the organizations that can help you, move quickly. And not only with store operations, but, media planning, marketing, any part of that has to be involved in this decision making to be able to have partners that can move quickly with you. And not everyone has that capability either on the marketing or media side.
That's very true. And great advice, rooted in culture, as it seems to always be when it comes to people-driven industries. But thanks, John, so much for your time today and for your wisdom as a specialist. We really appreciate it and look forward to seeing some of your products out there, Spotify products out there in the retail space.
Keep looking. They'll be there.
Thanks, John.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.
Now it's time for our namesake segment, What If, So What, and most importantly, Now What? Hey, Jim.
Hey, Kim.
That was such a great conversation with John. He's a true retail veteran. He's seen it all, but yet he humbly calls himself a specialist, not an expert. I wonder if that's an attitude the entire retail industry should adopt. What did you think of the conversation?
Yeah, let's start there. Like that specialist, that's been just running through my brain the whole time, specialist versus expert. And I was just parsing that whole idea down, right? But I actually had a new term for John, and I hope he runs with this. And I mean this with the utmost respect. I think he's a retail historian.
Ooh.
Because, yeah, he's seen that evolution. He really kind of broke it down and analyzed it so perfectly about what changed, why, the move from regional to national, the emergence of big box and all that stuff today. So I just thought that was great. And I do like the idea of, my parsing out of specialists was we are applying new ideas into the industry, right? It's like you're bringing skills and perspective and approaches and methods from either outside of the category, or some different areas of specialization and things that are emerging and happening elsewhere. And you just happen to specialize on that category. So that was kind of my interpretation. I know we didn't really hover and break it apart into a million little pieces, but I love that idea. And I'm going to add historian to that.
I like it.
I also think that it really made me think about what kind of a new dimension about what retail really is, because we think of the store, right? We think of a place you go that has aisles and you pick things out and you pay for them and you leave and you take them home. And it's so much more. I think it's almost a substitute for the consumer experience. I mean, you guys were talking about direct to consumer brands. And I think too about healthcare and financial services and banking and wealth management and other industries, and how they're really loosely using the word retail maybe as a substitute. But I was thinking about something that hadn't come up, and that's like the different kinds of retail. Because to me, going back to my childhood, Kmart was sort of the big box, or Montgomery Ward. But those pale in comparison to, a Walmart or a Target today. But when you think of the retail experience, you think about, we start to categorize them by type of store or the type of retail. That's a big box. You have a certain expectation. That's a shop, right? That's a boutique. Somewhere there's a difference between a shop, at least in my mind, and a boutique. Maybe it's the type of things that are sold. It's the way that they're sold. Maybe it's more than just the size. There's certain expectations. There's the mom and pop store, right? Everyone sort of invokes a certain thing that goes along with that retail experience, and then online or digital, they all involve some kind of expectation. That kind of stuck out to me. And I think, well, how do you apply that dimension to other elements of digital or even in other categories? I love that he talked about I wrote this down as the return of the merchandiser.
Yes, right.
The art form. Can we work with some retailers that are very merchandiser heavy? And it is a different style. It's buyer focused, right? It's more than just cutting deals. It is really a pulse on the audience, on the segment, on the buyer. I'll bring this word up again. We've brought it up many times before. It's empathy, right? So, the empathetic merchandiser. I don't know that we've lost that in retail, but, I love the idea that it's coming back as a differentiator. And those are some of the little things that can have big impacts. We'll come back to that later as we get into more of our analysis. But those are the things that really stuck out to me as kind of old concepts kind of coming around again and parsing out other things that other elements that define the customer experience. So, Kim, what did you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting observation around the role of the merchandiser. I feel like, John's refrain of creative merchandising, you're right. The retail space has moved away from that because of the global stores where everything has to be, you walk into a Target or Walmart or Best Buy and the store footprint is the same. The layout's the same, depending on the size of the store, but all A stores look the same. All B stores look the same. There's merchandising plans that come down from corporate. So there really isn't a lot of room for that creative merchandising at the local level, like I was talking about in my intro. The store managers don't necessarily have the freedom or flexibility to curate their in-store experience to their customers that are coming in and out every day. And I know that that's a point of frustration for a lot of those brands. Whereas online, with some of these DTC brands, they do have a lot more flexibility in creative merchandising, partially because they can test a million different things, through A/B testing and MVT testing.
Right.
But they also, in the DTC space in particular, might have just a smaller assortment. And with, constraint comes creativity. So I do think that it's a great way to look at another area to disrupt the retail space. But, some of the other things I thought that he was really provocative on is the retail winners that he was talking about during the pandemic weren't the ones that had, the capabilities of necessarily like in-store pickup or creative merchandising or, some of these things that we saw spring up. But it was really the flexibility to redeploy people, to reinvent processes, to launch new technologies, to meet the customer that day, their needs that day in the course of the pandemic. And, I think we've both seen in retrospect now that we're kind of, I don't know, not the tail end of the pandemic, but there's maybe been a pause in store shutdowns and things like that. We have seen those winners, retain some of those processes and flexibility, and they continue to build on that and, maybe have seen an increase in loyalty because of the way they were able to be flexible over the pandemic. And talking a little bit more about creativity and merchandising and just extending that to innovation, I thought his comments on, what qualifies as innovation were really interesting. Everyone looks to the other in the retail space, but that really doesn't offer any room for differentiation or understanding the real needs of your particular customers. And I just keep coming back to that kind of local flavor. How do you really build the relationships with your customer? And I'm not talking about automated personalization. I'm talking about true, like, how do you build a trusting relationship with your customer if you're a global brand and you enforce homogenous approaches to everything across your operations?
Yeah. Kim, I've never heard the phrase. I really enjoy the warm automated personalization your brand provided for me. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Great bot. Loved it.
Yeah. Right.
Kim, I think if you want to jump a little further ahead, I think that kind of brings us to our what if. And I'm glad you brought up innovation because it's a topic I think you and I are going to talk about a lot more in the future. As we think of these sort of white noise words, that's a little bit of one of them. It deserves a little bit of attention, but it really is relevant here. And, I can't think of another category that has been more impacted by both negatively in some ways and positively in others by digital and then by COVID. So, it's like retailers have gone through a huge transformation over the last 5 to 10 years, very omni-channel driven, certainly Amazon. We can't not talk about Amazon and talk about retail. But I feel like there's a sort of we were in a post-Amazon era with retail. So if you withstood that, if you weren't Circuit City and Blockbuster, right? If you got through it, then where are you, right? What did you remerge as, right? And how did you do that? And then COVID hit, right? And then that pushed those survivors right through another test.
Right.
It's innovation. We use the word a lot. We use this word reinvention a lot. And the only person I really want to talk about with reinvention is Madonna, who's really done it. But aside from Madonna, it's like one of those words that it comes up over and over again. But I think the question here, the what if, is what if you could reinvent relentlessly? And how do you do that? How are you in a position to be able to constantly adapt, constantly change, constantly react, and kind of be true to your mission and your customer?
Right.
So, if you could do that, Kim, if you could have one direction, one strategy, one value proposition today, another one tomorrow, so what? What does that mean? Because I do think that that's what it's going to take.
So I think the so what is you have to, yes, you can reinvent yourself over and over and over, but only within, I would say, a particular slice. Because I think retailers today, and John started kind of alluding to this, I think in order to reinvent yourself, but stay authentic, which we know is so important to brands today, you need to still have a point of view as a retailer, define your call to action. You can't be all things to everyone. And I think a lot of, especially the big box retailers, this is what they're trying to do. Bring interesting, curated products to your audience. This is the creative merchandising piece. Have a truly differentiated value proposition, and then use technology to enable innovation or reinvention. But the technology can't be the innovation. I feel like that's a list of things that if you can get those things foundationally correct, then within those constraints, you could reinvent every day. You could reinvent a digital experience, once an hour through some testing and some personalization technologies. But if you stray from a point of view, if you stray from a clear call to action, if you try to be all things to everyone, the downstream effects of not having that focus just is going to fragment you and confuse your customer. So to me, it's like, yes, retailers are suffering. They're sort of stuck in having to comp, and they comp based on exactly what they did last year. And so their hands are tied. They think they can't break out of that. But I do think that the more successful brands who've, hit on these foundational pieces, you do see themselves reinventing. I would just say their merchandising. That's what I would simplify it as. And that tends to be really successful. And I think, leaders, the so what of that is leaders really do need to examine how flexible their operating model is. If any, quote unquote experiment proposed takes, months to discuss and vet and pros and cons, well, that's not flexible, and it begs the question, if you can't make decisions like that, having some foundation underneath you, how flexible can you really be in meeting customer needs when the next crisis hits, big or small? So I think leaders really do need to ask themselves, well, what is innovation in my organization? What's defined as innovative? And is there a better balance that can be achieved in the risk reward of innovation in the industry has been so fickle and fleeting in terms of the larger shifts and trends?
Yeah.
But now what? So having said all that.
Yeah, that was a double so what.
It is a double so what. It's a double so what.
Maybe I'll give you a double now what. But
okay.
I think, again, innovation is a good way to put it. I think adaptation is part of innovation, but really sometimes innovation is just, what do I need to change today that is hitting the unmet needs of my customer, right? So back to empathy again. But, we've said this before, and I like this idea of like, let's not just focus on the technology. I think John was, for me, very clear about it. Like, there's a lot more than just driving technology. And we know through the innovation circles, there are many types of innovation. And I always used to joke, like, let's just build a mobile app. That must be an innovation, right? It's back to why. Why do you need to do that? So I think the now what is, I guess, twofold. One is understand that there are many types of innovation, and there's a spectrum of innovation that needs to focus on making good decisions. You can't do it all. You don't need to do it all. You really got to be true to your mission, your purpose, your point of view. I think even if that point of view feels maybe a little redundant, at least you have one.
Yes.
Right. And so you do have these sort of like soulless brands out there that, can exist on an Amazon storefront. And I guess you could make some money doing that. But, there's a lot of things that Amazon can't do. And John brought this up, and what I've discovered, there's a hashtag WACD, what Amazon can't do. Check it out. And it's an interesting thread, or probably a subreddit somewhere I got to spend more time on later. But, how do you differentiate that shopping experience in a way that, again, reflects that point of view is focused on that gap between what you're doing today and what your customer really needs. And I'm glad you brought up personalization again, because you got to do it your way. I mean, when if you open your Amazon storefront, and it's going to be personalization will be done Amazon's way. It's really one experience. It's a monolithic experience. It's very powerful. Personalization is great. The supply chain and fulfillment model is fantastic. I'm seeing Amazon trucks up and down, probably more Amazon trucks up and down my street than UPS and FedEx trucks lately. I don't know what you guys are seeing. So that's all very powerful, but ultimately in itself is kind of undifferentiated. So back to what I was saying earlier, how can you be a shop? How can you be a big box, which comes with certain expectations that's going to differentiate uniquely? But I don't think beating Amazon is really a mission. Like, how do we just keep up with Amazon? Because then you're just giving into playing Amazon's game.
Right. And
so again, innovation to me is always about making really good decisions, differentiating between a sustainable innovation, which is just getting better at what you're doing today. You got a great value proposition. How do we double down on that? Or do we do something new that's actually disruptive, which gets a lot of attention, but could be more meaningful to your audience? I'll give you my little COVID example, and it's very romantic. So we have a fantastic little flower shop. That's keyword shop. It's what I put as my definition.
Right.
It has a certain feel. And then one of their COVID tricks, their COVID response was they called it backdoor pickup, and they have this little parking lot in the back, and everybody's pickups and flowers and bouquets would be out there with your name on it. And I thought to myself, like, what happens when somebody just picks up, should I just drive here without making an order and impress my wife with a bouquet that I didn't pay for? That's awful, right? But it worked. It's dark, but that's what I was thinking. How does this work, in the city? But it did. And to me, that was like, that created such a dimension to that shop and that brand, that very small, that really works. And I guess that's my second. Now what is, how do you make many small bets instead of one big one? And I think that's going to be the trick to reinvention. And it's not limited to retail either, right? How do you get really good at being agile, at experimenting, at using data? I think this is where the digital equation comes in, so that you can make many, many small bets instead of one big bet. And I think that's the long game to reinvention. Those are my couple of now what's, Kim.
I like the know what's. They're good, and they align with the so what's. I just keep going back to, within constraint, there is a multitude of creativity and opportunity for creativity. And I like the small bets versus one big bet. I mean, very rarely do we see an iPhone anymore, and not everything can or should be an iPhone. And I just don't think that is how consumers today respond to retailers. And I am using retail in this case because I think, not that a consumer thinks retail is, there's a difference between the business model. And I think exactly to your point, what you come to experience going into the flower shop in your local neighborhood versus a Walmart, different expectation. But like we talked about with John, there's maybe because of the pandemic, a little bit more of a gravitation back towards those local shops because they're just a better experience. And then you have to kind of unpack, well, why are they a better experience? And I think you come back to some of the so what's and now what's we talked about.
Awesome.
Well, great talking as always, Jim.
Thanks, Kim.
We'll talk a lot more about innovation, I know, in the future. And we have to get John back. He was a great guest, and I would love to hear a little bit more about his day job, which we didn't really talk to him about at Spotify. So we'll work on that.
Yeah, we'll bring him back.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, everyone, for listening today. And until next time, keep asking, what if, so what? And most importantly, now what?
You've been listening to What If, So What, the digital strategy podcast from Perficient with Jim Hertzfeld and Kim Chopek. We want to thank our Perficient colleagues, JD Norman and Rick Bauer, for our music today. Subscribe to the podcast and don't miss a single episode. You can find this season along with show notes at perficient.com. Thanks for listening.